Are you
Hello,
okay?
everybody. We're meeting with Kyle-MacMillan, and he is an art critic and a journalist. And I've got a lot of questions for you, Kyle. How did you get involved in this, in the art critic side of the art equation?
I actually came at this from the journalism point of view. There's sort of two ways you can do this. Well, actually, there's more than two, but you can come at this from the art side, and sometimes people who are artists or somehow got into art somehow graduate and sort of flow around into becoming a critic. But I actually came at it from the journalism side. I have a graduate degree in journalism from Columbia University in New York. So I had a background in the arts. I don't have a degree in art or art history, but I've studied art history in my undergraduate years. So when I started out as a journalist, I started out as an arts journalist and an arts critic. So that's just the direction that I took. And a lot of what I know about art and a lot of what I know about criticism, I've learned on the job over the last 20, 25 years.
I think that's a really nice thing about the art world is that you do learn a lot on the job, and whatever they teach you in school pretty much isn't the knowledge you need once you get out, or isn't the knowledge necessarily you need on a practical kind of a daily basis. But I'm interested. You knew more that you wanted to be involved in journalism than you knew you wanted to be involved in art. Is that right?
At the beginning, yeah, that's right, at the beginning. And back in those days, there weren't classes. You couldn't get a degree in arts criticism. You can now. I think even at the School of the Art Institute, there's new arts. I think they call it new arts journalism. You can specialize in that. And then there now are schools, not a lot, but there's a few now who actually offer an arts criticism degree program, and that just didn't exist when I was in school. You couldn't do that even if you wanted to.
And where were you raised?
Kansas City, Missouri.
And then, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so most of my background is the Midwest. I've spent almost my entire career in the Midwest, well, in the West too. I mean, I suppose Denver is not really the West or the Midwest, but Kansas City, the Midwest, and Denver is where I've spent most of my career.
Where do we go with this? Who decides where you write?
Well, there's sort of two different ways to answer that question. At the moment, I'm a freelancer, which is a whole nother kettle of fish than the world that I was in for most of my life, which was a full-time critic at a newspaper. But unfortunately, there aren't very many full-time critics at newspapers anymore. The Chicago Tribune does not have a full-time art critic. The Chicago Sun-Times does not have a full-time art critic. And there's a lot of newspapers that don't. So that world is pretty much coming to an end. I just don't see that world coming back. And right at the moment, nobody quite knows what's going to replace it. But if you are a full-time critic at a newspaper, you make most of the decisions. Most of the decisions about what you cover and how you go about your job are things that you decide. You have quite a bit of autonomy within your realm. But as a freelancer, you spend a great deal of your time out there just trying to get the next writing gig. You're constantly writing editors at national publications or locally and just trying to convince them to let you write about something. So you spend a lot of time marketing yourself, marketing your story ideas.
How much of what is published of yours is a story versus a review?
Well, right now when it comes to the art, it's probably it's about half and half, I would say, because the Chicago Sun-Times, where I do a lot of the local writing, they tend to be more interested in what they call previews, which I'm not really sure why that's the direction they take, but that's the direction they take. Although I just had a review published in the Sun-Times on Friday, and they wanted a review of that show. So that's just their preference. They tend to want to often do things before the show actually opens and before you can really get in to see the show. So that sometimes is why we wind up doing previews. So today
I'm sorry. You talk.
No, I was just going to say I was at the Renaissance Society today doing interviews because it's a show, and I saw sort of the beginnings of what's going to be an installation at the Renaissance Society. But there's no way I could review the show because there is no show to review yet. In fact, some of the art's not even done. I saw some of the art in its sort of beginning stages. So, but I've got to write the story now because they want it before the show actually opens. So it's going to be a preview. So it's sort of weird sometimes to write about something you haven't seen, but that's what you wind up doing.
Yeah, definitely. But and as a freelancer, you tend to get paid less, or are you bringing home a similar amount of money?
No, not at all. Freelance, I mean, I'm living sort of, it's a very difficult life because you don't get paid much at all as a freelancer. It's slave labor is largely what it is. Even if you write for better publications, you get paid a little bit more, but you don't get paid much at all compared to what you would get as a full-time critical writer somewhere. It's a very difficult life.
What do you think about doing about it? I mean, writing a book isn't necessarily more lucrative, is it?
No, I just finished up a book project, actually, and that did pay, it paid pretty well, but it's still, book projects don't come along with any regularity, so that was a book project. If you could do one book project a year, that would probably be really good, but that's not going to pay the rent either. So probably I think I'm in a very transitory situation right now where I'll probably wind up having to leave arts journalism entirely and go off and do something else. But the problem is I haven't quite determined what the something else is going to be yet.
Got it. How different is it writing for an assignment from a local publication and a national publication?
The big difference is when you write for art magazines is that you're heavily edited. That you will send in a story, and then they pretty much go through that story word by word, and you have this whole almost sort of negotiation process that you go through, and that you send in what you wrote, they edit it, then you sort of comment and then send back sort of your replies to their edits, and you wind up in the end with what might be called a compromise piece, with what between their edits and what you want. And it's just a complicated back and forth process with national publications. That's just how it works.
Do you have a preference?
Oh, well, I mean, my preference would be doing newspaper work because that's what I've long done. I mean, if I had my preference right now, I'd be a full-time critic because, I mean, there's the other problem with being a critic, being a freelance critic, is all you're really winding up doing is writing. You're writing mostly previews and reviews. You're not doing the full gamut of the type of writing that you would do at a newspaper. And you don't really have the kind of clout, you don't have the kind of journalistic clout that comes with being the critic at the newspaper. And that clout can be important for lots of different reasons, depending on what it is you're trying to do.
Let's talk about clout further. I like this, go on with that. What does that do for you? What does it do for what you're writing?
Well, I think I'll answer that question in a number of different ways. But if you look at the Chicago art scene, what's missing here is not so much criticism, because we have that in various publications. There's quite a bit of national publications that cover the Chicago art scene. So if you just want people to go out and cover art shows and write a review of one kind or another, we've got that. I mean, that happens with some regularity. It doesn't happen that much in the two newspapers, but it happens on websites. It happens, in some of the other publications. I mean, Time Out used to do that. I don't think we're going to get much of that anymore since there basically is no Time Out Chicago anymore. But still, it happens. What you don't have in Chicago is what a critic brings to the table, which are ongoing critical assessments of the scene at large. What direction is the Chicago Art Institute taking? Is that the right direction? They just bought a Thomas Hart Benton recently. Was that a good way to spend the money at the Chicago Art Institute? Where does the Thomas Hart Benton fit into the American holdings of the Chicago Art Institute? What are they doing in terms of their finance? But also, I think what I used to do stories a lot like what the Tribune's been doing lately about the Field Museum, talking about their finances, talking about their deaccessioning of artworks and other objects from the museum. There's huge questions when you look at the Field Museum about their ethics of what they did. And that's what I used to write about too. What are the ethics of deaccessioning from an art museum? There's so many things that a critic looks at beyond just, oh, I went to an art show and I reviewed it. It's almost a small percentage of what you do as a full-time ongoing art critic. And what I mean by clout is when you work for like the Chicago Tribune or a daily newspaper, it brings you the ability to be able to get to the museum and ask those questions and actually get answers from the director or somebody else at the museum that you need answered. That's what that clout does. When somebody from a newspaper, from a Chicago Tribune calls and says, ask you direct probing questions about what you're doing, and that you can get answers. And really, if you look at the field museum coverage lately in the Tribune, that's a lot what a critic could be doing if they were covering, an art museum or an art institution or whatever. But it's even bigger than that. It's covering, there's a lot of questions about an art scene beyond that, the whole ecosystem of the art scene. What's missing? What's happening? What's working? What's not working? Those are all things that art critics do on an ongoing basis.
I think all of those subjects are immensely interesting. And so do you feel you don't write much like that at all for the currently and for the past 12 months or more?
No, not really. No, not really, because there isn't really much interest in that here, and there's no real space for that here. There's just not a lot of interest in that kind of writing here, no. And I think newspapers are not real keen on letting a freelancer delve into those issues because you don't really work there. You're not somebody, I think there's a real reticence to let a freelancer delve into those kinds of issues and probe those kinds of issues. That's the kind of thing they'd want a staffer to do, but they don't have a staffer, so they wind up just not doing it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a sad situation, and I don't know what the answer is. I mean, there's obviously more criticism showing up on the internet, but to a large extent, there's fewer eyeballs seeing it. And
you could
less depth.
And you could question what kind of criticism is showing up on the internet. A lot of what's showing up on the internet are blips, where you get the 2 or 3 paragraph blip, and you get photographs of the show, but you're not really getting a full-fledged, in-depth sort of review, like, real in-depth criticism. I don't know how much of that's really out there on the internet.
I think you're accurate. I think that's right. And everything gets shorter and, a little bit punchier, but not the same kind of, not much depth at all. And correspondingly, there's fewer people that are going to art galleries, and we've discussed this here a little bit previously, is, the critical mass, the artist who goes to an art exhibit and is physically moved by it and has life-changing or at least art-changing experience as a result of that. That's in the decline also, so that, what we're talking about here is, I don't know, the shallowing sort of the aesthetic response and the breadth of it, but I don't know that you're getting more people involved.
Is there a feeling amongst the people you talk to that that's true in Chicago? I mean, I just read the piece that Jerry Saltz wrote for New York Magazine, where he really went into this whole decline of New York galleries and New York attendance, but is there a feeling that that's true in Chicago too amongst the people you're talking to?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much true across the board, and I think it's less true in New York, but yeah, I think there is a lot of truth to that. There are the corollaries of other ways of doing business, of other kinds of communication, of more people buying more art, over the internet, and I think it's a mixed blessing. I think my biggest concern is that if people are not having visceral aesthetic experiences when confronting art physically, how is that going to affect art making and art appreciation?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I'm still not really convinced how anybody is able to buy an artwork over the internet. I think you could probably do that if you knew the artist, knew the work, and had seen it, and then all you're really doing is sort of deciding which artwork you're going to pick over the internet. But I don't know how you really buy an artwork over the internet without being able to see it and be able to get a sense of its actual size and reality and textures of the canvas and all those others. You use the word visceral. I think that's exactly the right word. All those sort of visceral reactions that you have to an artwork when you're there literally in front of it, however it might present itself. You're not going to get that on the internet. And I don't know, but yet you have people spending tens of thousands of dollars for artwork over the internet. So it must be working.
I'm assuming that most of the sales that happen over the internet are by people who think they have familiarity with what's going on with a given artist's work, and then are looking at another example and they're extrapolating from a previous physical experience.
Yeah.
But I might be afraid to find out how many pieces people have purchased. But then again, more art sales is a good thing. But
No, that's true. That's true. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
How much of your writing is local? How much of it is out of town right now?
probably it's about half and half, I would say. I mean, I pretty much shut down all of my journalism for several months when I was working on this book project, which in a way was good and bad because it allowed me to focus on the book project. But then when I came back from that, I had one major story that got canceled because of that, because of the timing. And then what you really do spend your time doing with freelancing is you're always spending your time marketing for what you're going to be doing in the next few months. And I wasn't able to do that while working on the book project. So I sort of came back from that feeling really behind. And so now I'm trying to catch up, trying to get some assignments for the summer and that sort of thing. But, you know, I felt like I needed to do that to be able to focus on all I had to do for the book. So, you know, this is the back and forth that you do.
Wow. So as much time is spent marketing as writing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, without any doubt at all. Yeah, you're constantly sending, you know, they're called pitches. They're called story pitches or story queries, but story pitches, yeah, you're always pitching an editor about an idea. And then, of course, you're trying to come up with ideas. You're trying to also race a little bit because sometimes you're trying to get ahead of somebody else who pitches the idea before you. So, yeah, you're always trying to come up with some new way to pitch something or some new idea, and it's tough. And then you never really quite know what's going to make a New York editor actually stand up and take notice of something that you've sent them, because you have a great deal of, you know, that world can be as closed-minded as, you know, a lot of other worlds can be. New York can be an incredibly closed-minded place when it wants to be.
Yeah, for sure. How much time do you write what you want to write, and how much time do you write what you think they want to read, whoever they are?
Well, I think I get to do a lot of what I want to do because I don't really send out queries about things I'm totally uninterested in. If I'm not interested in doing it at all, I just don't even get involved in it. But you do, I mean, so I guess that cuts out the stuff right off the top that I don't want to do. There's very little that I do that I don't want to do. But yeah, you are playing this game of trying to come up with stuff that you think will actually interest an editor. I mean, you do spend quite a bit of your time doing that. And when you work full-time at a newspaper, you don't do that. You tend to get to do the things that you want to do and that you feel are important, and the newspaper has hired you, so they assume that you know what you're doing, and they kind of go along with most of your choices.
Are there situations where you know that a given editor is interested in everything he or she can get on a given artist or a given movement? Like like if Jeff Koons does something, I want to read about it, or...
See, that actually works. There's two different, if we use Jeff Koons as an example, that actually works good and bad. The good news is that if you've seen the thing about Jeff Koons, the New York critic or the New York editor has heard of them, so that's a good thing. But see, what's really interesting about New York, when I first started working for Art Forum, for example, I started working for them around, I don't know, 2001, 2002, and they sought me out because they wanted somebody to cover Colorado, Aspen. Particularly, they were interested in Aspen because of the art scene there, but also Denver. So they wanted somebody who could write about what was going on in that area. But what I quickly became to realize is they weren't really interested in writing about what people were doing in Colorado, what Colorado artists were doing. So you would send story pitches, and they would basically say, well, we've never heard of any of these artists, so we're not really interested in reviews of them. And you would sort of say, well, but that's the point. That's why you should be writing about these people, because you haven't heard of them, because you're sitting there in New York and you don't know what's going on in this part of the country. So you have that problem. And then on the other hand, so they want you to cover like the Jeff Koons show in Aspen some of the time. But on the other hand, the other side of that is there are so many Jeff Koons reviews, and you say, oh yeah, there's a Jeff Koons review in Chicago, and they go, yeah, but we just covered the one in Philadelphia, and a year before that we covered the one in New York, we're not interested. So it goes both ways. But this is one of the problems you really do have with trying to sell stuff to New York is if they haven't heard of it, they're suspicious of it, and they're likely not to be interested in it. And the only reason why they would have heard of it is because the person had a show in New York. So it's one of those chicken and egg things which can be very frustrating.
I agree. Are there artists that you are a proponent of? Do you champion certain artists and seek to get them more exposure if you can?
I mean, I don't do a lot of that in Chicago because the people that I'm primarily writing about are people that are pretty obvious to write about. I mean, The problem with the amount of art coverage that I'm doing is that we don't even get down, we barely get down to the mid-level artist, let alone the artist below the mid-level artist. Where, again, this is something I spend a great deal of my time doing in places like Denver, where, yeah, you really do have artists that you champion. I mean, when I first came to Denver, there were 3 art critics. There were 2 daily newspapers and a weekly newspaper. So there were 2 art critics that had been there for a long time. So there was kind of this established hierarchy that they had put in place. And when I came in, I sort of brought a fresh viewpoint to the whole thing. And yeah, I sort of challenged that hierarchy. I challenged who was there, and I asked, why are certain people being touted as being the top of the hierarchy? And why are some of these other people that have never gotten much attention? Why aren't they getting it? Why aren't they getting attention? I mean, that was part of the fun of it.
When did you move? Excuse me. When did you move to Chicago, and why?
Yeah, it was. Where are we now? I guess it was. Yeah, it was early part of last year. So it was about February of last year, and then I started freelancing. It took me about a month or 2 to sort of like get everything packed and unpacked and sort of get situated. So I started in March or April of last year. It's been about a year.
Why? Why did you come here?
Because my wife is getting a master's degree in writing at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So we came here, and she's also from here. So those were the 2 reasons why we came to Chicago. And you know, I took a buyout at the Denver Post, but I still had a job at the Denver Post. But there were already beginning to be rumblings. You know, we were all feeling that our jobs were very vulnerable even then. And you pretty much have to feel that way if you're a critic or an arts critic or an arts writer is not a high priority position at a newspaper. So when you have cutbacks, that's something you pretty much have to assume that a newspaper is going to be looking at cutting, because that's not something that they particularly value.
Do you think there's less criticism or quality criticism you do than there used to be, right?
Yeah, I do. I do think there's less quality criticism. I do. Part of that is just because of the same problem I'm having. I think quality criticism requires a certain amount of funding, and there's just not a lot of places for quality critics to get the kind of money that they would want to be able to write it. So that creates problems. The other thing is too, and Jerry Saltz has written about this too, the role of the critic, I think, has been greatly diminished. I mean, we don't live in a time where what critics write really, I don't know how big of a role that really plays anymore in the art world. But certainly, you know, we've come a long ways from the Clement Greenberg days. I mean, the pendulum has swung very far in the opposite direction. And I still think we're still in the time of the curator. I think we're still in this has been written about, you know, a great deal, but I think the curator still is king in the art world right now.
Who's got questions for Kyle, you guys? Raise some hands. Do you travel to write?
I haven't done so much traveling to write in this position. I have done some. I mean, I still go out to Colorado to write because I have connections there, and the art magazines are interested in Colorado, and I don't have much competition in Colorado. So, yeah, I do go out there, but I don't travel to write because art magazines don't pay you to travel. So if I say, oh yeah, I'll go anywhere to write for an art magazine, you pay for all of your expenses. So whatever money you're making from the art magazine, you have to subtract your own expenses because they're not going to cover that. There is no money, there is no travel money for anything that you do.
Jen, go ahead.
You said that what Chicago needs is a critic of the scene at large here, and I'm really interested in finding out about that sort of information. Are there any sort of entrepreneurial opportunities for starting up some sort of online magazine for subscription or something like that to disseminate that kind of information on your part?
Well, I'll tell you the model that the model that I think might work is one that is being used in...
Go ahead, I'm muted.
Are we okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay. The problem with that is that it actually does cost quite a bit of money if you're actually going to pay the people to work for the online magazine. If you're actually going to pay them something more than just a freelance amount of money, you actually have to have quite a bit of money to actually have this online magazine. So that's the problem. And so just to cite an example, Colorado Public Radio has decided that they're going to add an arts component to what they're doing, which is going to be a website and, of course, on-air writing and coverage of the arts. They're going to have 3 people. They're calling it an arts bureau, and then they're going to have a web person, and they're going to have just a reporter that will be both writing for the web and writing and then doing things for the radio. So it'll be 3 people, and they're going to be full-time jobs. But if you stop and think about that for a minute, I don't know what the budget for that is, but let's just say we're going to pay each of those people a round figure, $50,000. It's probably more than that. So that's $150,000 you need right off the top in expenses annually to make that happen. So you figure you're going to have at least $200,000 just for that arts bureau as part of Colorado Public Radio, and yet they're willing to do that. They've gotten grants for that, and they're willing to do that, and that's going to significantly boost arts coverage and criticism in the Colorado area. I would love to see something like that in Chicago, but I think it takes an entity like a public radio station or somebody that can do that kind of funding and can get the kind of grants that you're going to need to make that happen.
Hold on, let me unmute Jen and see if she's got. Jen, you want to follow up?
No.
See, the problem is that the models that we currently have are all pretty much based on either people writing for free or people writing for almost nothing, which is fine. I mean, that's good for the art scene in that they get the writing, but it isn't good for anybody who's actually doing the writing. It doesn't help them. And then you also tend to not get the best people when you're not paying them. So that's the challenge for that. I mean, the problem here is that there is no model to make this work. Everybody's trying to work on a model, but no one yet has come up with a model. So I actually, despite how pessimistic I sound, I'm actually somewhat idealistic because I do think there are going to be people who are going to come up with the models to solve this problem. We just haven't done it yet because we just have to, newspapers aren't going to be able to do this anymore. I think there's still a willingness to have criticism and a desire to have criticism. It's just a question of how do you deliver it and how do you pay for it?
Thanks, Jen. Annette, go ahead. Wait. Okay.
Okay. So when you have a choice about what you're writing about, how do you decide what issue or what individual artist or show to cover?
Well, I mean, anytime you're covering an art scene, I'll talk about this more as a full-time critic. Anytime you're covering an art scene, there's a lot of obvious things that you cover that are right off the top. You know, when there's the Roy Lichtenstein show at the Chicago Art Institute, you're going to cover that. There's no real question that you're going to do that. There's a lot of just obvious things that are going to be covered because they're of such an importance. You know, the new director of the Renaissance Society, because the Renaissance Society is one of the 4 or 5 most important institutions in Chicago, you're going to write about that. So there's a lot of obvious things that you're going to cover without giving a lot of thought. You're going to cover the main shows at all of the major galleries in Chicago without giving that a lot of thought. So this has always been one of the problems with art coverage is by the time you get done covering all the big boys, all the big boy galleries and all the big boy institutions, then whatever's left, that's what you wind up reviewing. That's the time you have to review the rest. And sometimes the rest can be even more interesting, but you just don't always have the kind of time to cover that. And how do you cover those things? Who do you pick? You pick things that you think are interesting. Most critics, like everybody else, there's just word of mouth. You talk to people, and they say, gee, have you gotten over to see X show? And if you hear that from 2 or 3 people that you trust, that you really need to get over to see X show, and you really need to write about that, you're going to go take a look at X show, and you're probably going to write about it. But I mean, I've reviewed shows. The only reason I reviewed them is because I got a press release and images, and I was totally fascinated by the images, and I was totally fascinated by the premise of the show. I went and took a look at it with somebody I'd never heard of. All I got was just this thing in the mail or an email or whatever saying, and I just was intrigued. I wanted to go see what it was, and and sometimes it's really exciting when you do that if it pays off. And yeah, of course you want to write about that because you want to make the new discovery. A new discovery is very exciting. So I think that partially answers your question.
Thank you.
So artists send you stuff and you act on it periodically? You get a lot of them?
Yeah, of course. I mean, again, being in Chicago and being a freelancer, I don't get that much stuff because I'm just not in a position for that, the way that works. But yeah, if you're at a newspaper and you're the art critic, you are inundated with stuff from, I mean, it's extraordinary how much stuff you're inundated with. But yeah, you get more than you could ever possibly want. And yeah, you go through and you try to go through it as best you can. And again, some of that stuff is obvious stuff you're going to attend, and some of that stuff is stuff you would never review in 1,000 years. So you kind of
make a determination as to whether or not it's interesting to you and whether or not it's interesting to your readership.
Yeah, but largely, I basically, and most critics I know, tend to go with what's interesting to them, and then we tend to believe that what's interesting to us hopefully will be interesting to other people. You start getting into trouble when you start doing the game of trying to figure out what's going to be interesting to other people. That's a game that's a very difficult game to play, because how do you figure that out? So you just have to trust yourself.
Right. I think that's totally true for visual artists also, in that, you know, if you start trying to guess what the trend is or second guess somebody, by the time you figure it out, it's left the station. Right.
Yeah. And I want an artist who's doing what they truly, truly believe in, not something they think the art market wants, or that, you know, that's going to, their gallerist wants, or they think is going to sell. Those things don't tend to produce really good art. None of those things. It has to come from what you really want to do.
Totally agree. Amy, your turn. Go ahead. Whoops. Wait, you were unmuted and I muted you. Go ahead now.
Yeah. Do you cover visual art only, or other types of art?
You know, I actually am a very odd creature, because I actually spend about half of my time doing visual art, and I spend about half of my time covering classical music. So I'm a hybrid, and I always have been for my entire career. It's just what I've done. I'm a little bit like, there's a writer for New York Magazine, whose name just went right out of my head, who writes architecture and classical music and does both for that magazine. And he used to be at Long Island Newsday. So I'm a lot like him. I split my time right down the middle, which is exactly what he does.
And your territories now are basically Chicago, Denver, New York?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know definitely not New York, because there's no way I'm going to get anybody to let me write about New York, because that's where all the critics are. That's where the super competition is, in New York. So they've got more than enough critics covering New York. But yeah, basically this region. Yeah. You know, like Art Forum, I mean, there's so many people writing for Art Forum that Art Forum has largely told me that they're not going to let me write about anything in Chicago, because they already have critics working in Chicago. So I proposed to them everything but Chicago. So I just did a show for them that was in, I guess, February. That was in Colorado Springs that I saw when I was on a trip to Colorado. So they're interested in doing just about anything other. I mean, they want me to do just about anything other than Chicago, because they've got enough people already covering Chicago. So, what magazines tend to...
You should come to Utah. We need help.
Bad. What magazines tend to do is, as they say, they tend to rely on they use the same writers in the same places, and they rely on the people they know, and they tend to cover a lot of what they already know. So the big challenge with magazines is always trying to convince them to cover something they don't know. That's the challenge that you have, and it's not easy. And I think places like Utah struggle with that, because there aren't critics, that the New York magazines don't tend to have on-site critics in Utah, so then you suffer as a result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, they don't. And if it does, it's frequently the New York Times that's doing a 12-page story, you know, like once every 3 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And last Friday, you wrote a nice piece in the Sun-Times about Jun Kaneko's show in Millennium Park. And I worked with Kaneko for over 20 years. And did you do a fair amount of research, or was the information provided to you?
Kaneko I've known for 20 years, so I've known his work. I didn't have to hardly do any research on that, because I know him, and I know Ree, and that was an easy thing to do, because I know the work. What was startling about that show was the whole new work that he's doing, the new Tanaki, what is it, Tanaki, I think is what he's calling those figures.
I pronounce it Tanuki.
Anime. Yeah, I think you're saying it right. But that was that totally caught me off guard, but then as well it should be. He's never shown that work anywhere. This is the first thing he's ever shown that work. But yeah, that was, I mean, I call and talk to June, but wound up not using a lot of what he had to say because there just wasn't that much space. But no, I didn't have to do much research for that show because I knew the work. So that was kind of easy.
Okay, but so do you do much? I mean, it looked to me like you knew what you were talking about. I was impressed. So, well,
but I mean, some things, yeah, you spend a lot. Some things you spend a lot of time doing research. Absolutely, of course you do. Yeah, it just depends on what you're doing and what you know about it. And yeah, yeah, and there's different ways to do the research. Sometimes it's book research, and sometimes it's just talking to people.
When you write for the Sun-Times, are you getting paid by the job, by the length of the article, by the word, by placement? What are the factors that determine compensation?
It's a set fee, and it's a set fee, and pretty much at the Sun-Times, it's a set length. It doesn't vary very much. Most of the time there, it's 600 words, which is what the Kaneko was. And 600 words is really not very much. So what you wind up doing, and the Kaneko piece is a really good example of that, you wind up, it's actually harder to write for that than it is to write a longer piece because you're desperately trying to inject as much content and depth into the piece as you can, but in an incredibly short amount of space. So you have to write, I think, in a way even better than you would if you were writing like a 1,000-word piece or a 1,500-word piece because you just don't have that kind of space. And on the other hand, you don't want to write something that's just superficial and kind of, you know, shallow. There's no real, not really interested in writing a shallow, superficial piece. So you just try to cram as much content as you can into 600 words. And that's just not much space.
And do they still edit you?
The Sun-Times almost doesn't edit you at all. Pretty much whatever I write with very few changes is what goes into the paper. It's almost a little bit scary. And the reason is that Sun-Times, like almost every newspaper, has almost no copy editing or editing staff at all because they've all been fired. So they are working on an incredibly skeletal staff. So pretty much whatever you send is pretty much what goes into the paper, which is a little bit scary because you actually kind of want editors to cover your back a little bit and make sure you don't do something stupid because sometimes you do.
I did, and I'm getting sued for it. I'm winning, but it's still expensive. So yeah, an editor can save your ass.
Sometimes you just make a dumb mistake. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. Tamara, go ahead.
Hi, Kyle. Thanks for speaking with
me.
Hi. So my question is, you mentioned press releases, and what would you recommend for writing a strong press release?
I think even more important than press releases are images. I think if a critic or anybody decides to write about your work, it's always more based on the images than anything that you write. I think images are more important because you actually want to see what the work looks like. So I would say if you're going to send stuff out, make sure that the images pop and really do tell people what your work really looks like. I think that's almost even more important than the words.
Thanks.
I mean, and one of the things that artists are always dealing with are artist statements, and I think artist statements, they can be useful. I've certainly seen some artist statements that actually are somewhat insightful and helpful, but for the most part, artist statements always seem to be sort of canned to me, or they seem to be something that the artist thought that they had to write, or maybe their gallery made them write. I think a lot of times the galleries make artists write statements, so they sort of do it under duress. So those aren't really very useful most of the time because they don't really say anything. And they're often written sort of art speak, which is just sort of this template language that doesn't say anything. So it's really not very useful. So anyway, I think the images are more important than the words. The thing that's the worst thing I think people do, I used to get this a lot where you just get cards for a show. People don't send out cards as much as they used to, but they used to send out cards and it would just have the person's name and then the show and the time with no real information and like you were just supposed to know the name. And I used to tell people the only people who can get by with that in the art world are those shows that happen in New York City, you know, where they say, it has to be like somebody we talked about earlier, like Jeff Koons and a date. Jeff Koons can get away with that. There aren't very many artists, you know, or Jasper Johns, you know, and you put the artist, you know, and the date, and everybody knows what you're talking about. But most artists can't get by with that. You really do need to know more than just the name.
So are you saying on a postcard to have other information?
Yeah. Image. Yeah, I think the image is the key thing. Yeah, a really cool image draws you into it. And You know, like some of the ones I like sometimes artists will do images in their studio when they're working on artwork. So you actually see them work. I think those can be kind of cool. But yeah, just a really good image of whatever, something that gives you a sense of who you are as an artist. Something that draws you in. But, you know, it's just like everything else in marketing. I mean, what you're doing is marketing, and you figure that you're getting all these other press materials from other people. And what you got to do something that sort of grabs people right off the bat. Like, what is it about what you're doing that grabs, is different and can grab somebody and make them look at it where they might not have looked at it. It's hard to say, but yeah, I just think the work is what ultimately does it. It's the work.
Who else has got a question? I see hands that are still up, but I'm assuming I'll ask you again. Jen, do you have another question?
Sorry. No.
Oops. All right, so that those down. Do you think it's any different than anywhere else on the planet?
What do you mean by that? You mean, like, do I think it's being different to be a critic like in Germany?
Yep.
You know what? I just can't say that. I do think that there are a lot more critics that work in Germany, but I'm not exactly sure why. I know that when at the Denver Art Museum, for example, we got the director of the Denver Art Museum is German, and I think he was very surprised in the United States that there wasn't more coverage of everything that the museum did. I think that took him by surprise. And I also think it took him by surprise that museums have to work harder to sell what they're doing in this country. Because I got the sense that in Germany, if you're at, I think he was in Hamburg, as I remember, if you put a show up in Hamburg, you just get covered. You don't really have to do like, I'm not sure they send out press releases, but you're not out there, you don't have a PR team, you know, really trying to draw in the coverage. It just sort of, it comes more or less naturally. But I think the other thing about places like Germany is, too, the distances are shorter. So if you do a show in Berlin, I think it's not that far to Frankfurt and some of those other cities, so those critics come and cover things pretty rapidly, pretty easily, where that doesn't work here. You know, if you're in Denver, you know, there's really nothing around for, you know, 500 miles or 1,000 miles in any direction, probably 500 miles in any direction. There's no one else covering it. It's the Denver Post or the Denver media, and that's it. So that's another issue, too. Where in Europe, it's not that big of a hop to go be the Paris critic and hop somewhere and cover something else. It's not that big of a deal.
Good point.
I don't know. I don't.
Sal,
the answer is I don't really know.
Okay. Sal?
I have a question. I was speaking with somebody who's does art advice, and she was making the case that for artists to get get written about, one of the way, and it's, you know, in her opinion was a valid way, was to pay an art writer or art critic, that gallerists do that all the time for shows, and that, you know, it was just as valid for artists to do that. And I was wondering what your perception is and experience.
You mean actually pay somebody to write it for a publication?
Yeah, or a review or something like this. And this is just a whole nother, like, you know, universe that I don't know anything about, and how this plays out between art writers or art critics and artists directly, as opposed to through a gallery or a museum that might pay a critic or a writer to do a piece about a show. So,
well, I would be...
Do you have any...
Wow, you're bringing up a really fascinating...
business plan.
No, you're bringing up a really, really very difficult ethics issue.
Mm-hmm.
Huge ethics issue. So let's start at the top. The New York Times would never, under any circumstances, allow any of its critics to be paid. The New York Times wouldn't even accept money to send it. Like if the New York Times sent a critic to Chicago to cover something, they would never, under any circumstances, accept even, you know, money for the plane trip. They wouldn't accept the free hotel room. They're not going to accept anything because they have incredibly strict ethical guidelines. So there is no paying for a review in the New York Times. It's not going to happen. Art magazines like Art in America, you know, when I started writing for Art in America, they have ethical guidelines. I mean, for example, like an essay for an artist, I think it is, you're not supposed to then be able to review that artist for like 2 or 3 years after that. The idea being that you just got paid by the artist to write, you know, the essay for their catalog or their show thing, so you're not supposed to write about them. Have I heard of flying in writers to do like a spread on something that's in an art magazine. Yeah, I think that happens sometimes, that the expenses get paid. But I don't really think that's so much reviews, though, as it is like feature stories in the art magazines. Most major are not going to want critics to be paid by the artist to write something for that magazine. That brings up a lot of ethical issues that most major news magazines aren't going to want. Does that mean there probably are magazines that would allow that? Yeah. There's probably websites that would allow that too. But even certainly no newspapers would do it. I don't think the major art magazines would ever knowingly, ethically allow something like that.
Sal, I've been involved in the art world for like 35 years, and I've never heard about it. What I have heard about, and I don't know if you're getting confused or somebody else is where an art critic is paid to write a catalog essay for an artist.
That's a whole other thing.
Yes.
Yeah,
who said that's a whole other thing? Kyle or Sal?
I did. Yeah, I said that. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and that happens. Now, Kyle, when somebody writes, let's say somebody asks you to write a catalog essay, do you feel that it's improper for you to write a review of that same artist, that same show, or to write something about the artist for a period of time, or it doesn't come into question?
No, that's good. Well, I mean, in my case, the catalog I was writing for was Nick Cave here in Chicago. So, yeah, I don't think I could ethically write about Nick Cave for, I don't know exactly what that period of time is, but yeah, if the Sun-Times were to come to me in the next year or two and say, gee, we'd like Nick Cave, I'm going to say right up front to the editor, okay, you're aware that I worked on the catalog a year ago for this show. And then probably somebody at the Sun-Times is going to have to make an ethical decision about, is it 2 years has to pass before I can write something for the Sun-Times about Nick Cave? Is it 5 years? Yeah, but there are people who make those determinations. But I'm ethically bound to tell anybody, if they're interested in me writing about Nick Cave, yeah, I worked on his catalog. I mean, I just would have to tell them that up front, because that's the way the ethics of that would go.
I think this is more about your higher standard of ethics than ethics in the industry, and I think more people wouldn't be have as high standard as you.
It depends, but I mean, like I say, the Art in America, I believe their standard is 2 years. That's their cutoff. If you want to review somebody, it's 2 years for Art in America, just to give you one example of a magazine. That's what they're... Now, do people cheat on that, slide by that? Sure they do, but that is the ethical guideline of Art in America, is 2 years. And I think most art magazines have something along those lines.
Makes sense. I appreciate that. Okay. Steve Grossman, go ahead.
Kyle, I'm just wondering, as an art critic, how much opportunity you get to sort of speak casually with other critics or artists or curators, or I'm just sort of curious, does being a critic create a barrier that, or is that just not an issue for you?
Well, it's interesting. Everybody sort of does this their own way. I think you always do want to keep a certain amount of distance between you and the world that you're reviewing. But, there's actually, I was talking to one critic who said, for example, like he writes about things at the Chicago Art Institute. He said, yeah, he's never really met any of the curators at the Art Institute, and he doesn't want to meet them. He just wants to go and look at the show, and he never wants to have any interaction with critics or with curators at the Art Institute. I think that's kind of weird. I mean, if I were going to go review a show at the Art Institute of Chicago, I mean, it's very likely that I would at least want to have some basic interaction with, and maybe at least want to be able to ask the curator a few questions. But I think I do want to know some curators, and I think I do want to be able to ask them questions. But on the other hand, I also want to spend time at the show by myself, just with me and the art, and no curator, nobody else talking in my ear. So, ways. I think the theory is, I think, with certain critics is they want to be able to go into a show the way the average person would go into the show. They want to see it the way, like, if somebody in off the street would go into the show, they wouldn't be able to talk to the artist. They wouldn't be able to talk to the curator, and what would their perceptions be? But I don't know if I fully agree with don't fully agree with that. But you do have to be careful, because if you start becoming friends with artists, that can be difficult, because then are you really writing an objective review of the show, or are you writing the review the way you're writing it because you're buddies with the artist? I mean, you have to be careful with all that sort of thing.
Right. I guess one thing I was wondering, though, was not so much if you're talking to people when you're reviewing a specific show, but earlier when you were saying when you used to have a regular full-time job in the newspaper, that you're sort of covering a whole art scene, and in order to cover the scene, that you sort of have to be at least on some level kind of involved with it, you know, but that.
Well, I don't know if you need to be involved with it, but you need to certainly be talking to people. You know, it's interesting. I was just talking to Suzanne Guez today at the Renaissance Society. We got to talking about, she said, you know what you really need to write about? She said, you ought to write about those sculptures along the lakefront, you know, along Lake Michigan. She said, why doesn't somebody write about that? And I said, it's a really good point. I mean, they are really poor quality sculptures. And yeah, you really do wonder why somebody isn't writing about that. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to be able to write a long column on those sculptures, but it's true. You wonder why doesn't write something about that, because there's obviously, I don't even know how that works, but yeah, it's a good suggestion.
Okay, thanks.
I hope I answered that. I'm not sure I did.
No, you're all right. So. John Edding, go ahead, John.
Not a whole lot to feel real good about here. What I'm wondering about, if you would speak to us about what you think the future holds. What's this going to be like 10 years from now, 5 years from now? We're definitely moving in a direction. Where are we going to end up?
Well, okay, I still, as I said a little bit earlier, I still actually am, maybe I'm hallucinating, but I'm still actually optimistic about all this. I actually think we're going to come up with a way, we're going to come up with a model for real criticism. I just don't know how that model is going to work. That's what I was trying to say earlier about what Colorado Public Radio is doing, where they're doing a nonprofit sort of arts bureau where they're actually going to pay. I mean, in their case, they're only going to pay 3 people. They're going to have, as I said, a bureau chief, and then one sort of guy who's focused more on the radio, one that's focused on the website. But they're going to pay for it. They're going to have resources to bring to bear to do that. And it's going to be done on a nonprofit basis. So they're willing to go out and raise money and have a foundation support for that sort of thing. I kind of think that's the future. I think the future is nonprofit arts criticism. That's where I think we're headed. You've got people raising money for museums. You've got people raising money for art spaces, residencies. You're going to have people raising money for nonprofit arts criticism, whatever you want to call them. I think that's where we're headed.
I haven't heard that before. That's an interesting idea. I could see that working.
Yeah, I think that's one model. But the key to that model, of course, is independence. Whatever it is that you come up with, they need to be an independent entity. And immediately that starts being difficult, because if you're raising money, whoever's giving the money may want to have some sway over the kind of criticism that's done or who you're. So you've got to be able to maintain that independence. That's the critical element there.
Your thinking is right. That's a good point.
But yeah, I actually am trying to be optimistic about all this. I just, but obviously I don't have a crystal ball to be able to predict how. I think something's going to happen. There's going to be new models for this.
Artists are always rebels.
Yes, and critics can be rebels too. So yeah, exactly.
Do you think about doing any curating, Kyle?
I do. What I about that is, it's like that's another one of those chicken and egg things where I haven't ever really done it, so I don't really have any experience at doing it. So it's like whenever I would propose something, somebody would want to know what my experience of doing it is. So but yeah, I would be interested in that to a certain degree. Yeah, absolutely. There's just times when I probably can't say, but I've certainly had times in my life where you make connections among a group of artists and you say something like, why doesn't anybody ever do X show? I've said that many times. And that show is just never done. So you keep thinking, wow, I wish somebody would do that. I wish somebody would do that. So maybe sometimes it ought to be me who actually does it. is, you know, it's hard to get somebody to allow you to do that.
I'd like to see what you come up with. Lindy, your turn. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, Kyle. Yeah, I
Hi.
live in northern Michigan.
Okay.
And there's a film that was filmed on Mackinac Island here that is called The Art Critic, and I wondered if you might have seen it.
No, I don't think I have.
It's a really fun film. It's in national distribution, but it's by a film producer who has a strange way of living up here but doing big projects. His name is Richard Brower, and it's a fun movie.
Wait, is this movie available on Netflix, or is it only in theaters? What's the deal?
I think it should be available on Netflix. It's called The Art Critic, and it's a story filmed on Mackinac Island. It's a fun movie.
Okay, I'll look that up. That sounds good. Yeah,
it does sound good, because I don't think there's been too many other movies I can think of on art critics.
I think you might all enjoy watching it. It involves an artist, it involves an art critic who is escaping a lot of crisis in his career, and he is put on the spot and challenged to participate in an art show. So.
Okay. All right. That sounds good.
And then also I wondered if you, with all of the art that you review, if you have developed an extensive art collection yourself, or if you have the, you know, opportunity to collect art.
I do actually collect art. There again, that brings up another interesting ethical question. There are critics who will not collect at all because they think somehow that that's an ethical. It's amazing how many ethical things come into play in all this. But yeah, I have over the years. I don't have a major collection, but yeah, I bought some things that it's just every once in a while I've come across stuff that I really like, and I think, well, I think I'll buy that. I like that. So yeah, I have. Absolutely have. Yeah.
And I was curious, you know, how in your personal life you keep yourself in a plane of not being critical. You know, I mean, I know that being an art critic doesn't mean that you're criticizing constantly. It's that you have a critical analysis on what you're looking at. But in your own life, do you find that is projected on different aspects of your life, that you're looking for a judgment on everything?
I don't know about that so much, but I think what's happened with me is that I can't really look at art or really pretty much anything in the arts anymore without looking at a critic. You know, the idea, people say, well, you can just go and do that and enjoy it, but I don't really know that I can really do much of that anymore. I think I just see things as a critic. I think
it's kind of frustrating, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't see much of a way to go back on that anymore. It's just that's the way it is. I'll be writing reviews in my head for the rest of my life, even if I'm not even an art critic anymore. I'll still be writing them in my head, I'm sure. That's just the way it's going to be.
Yeah, we have that problem as artists, that we can't look at things without seeing a ton of colors.
Yeah, I think it's the same idea. I think it's that idea. Yeah, you can't help yourself. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I think this has been really cool, Kylie. You've shared a lot of really great information, candidly. Does anybody else have a question before we wrap this up? Sal, do you have another question? I'm assuming you don't, but do you?
No, I think my hand was just left up, so it's in.
Okay, cool.
All right, great.
All right, Kyle. Well, thank you very, very much. This has been really great. I really appreciated it. I look forward to seeing what you're going to do and reading more of what you are doing. So I think it's been great. Thank you so much. Let me unmute everybody so we can all echo that too. And everybody's unmuted.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Everybody, I will see you in a week. Thanks all.
Bye.